Richard, I feel, created this piece because he wanted to combat the other side of these arguments that are put in mainstream theaters all the time. There was no home for it, so he had to produce it himself.
Welcome to Wrong Speak, the podcast about the things we believe to be true but cannot say. I'm Jonathan Kay. In this week's episode, a fascinating conversation with free-thinking Indigenous comedian Craig Lauzon. But first, some Wrong Speak news. My co-host Deborah So will return soon, but won't be here for a few episodes. As an intellectual dark web superstar, she's become quite the in-demand commodity. As some of our Twitter fans know, someone has even turned Deborah into an action figure. In a week or two, Wrong Speak will be releasing its first crossover episode. My friend Niru Kumar, another Toronto-based journalist and a former broadcaster with the CBC, recently launched her Desiland podcast, focusing on the experience of South Asians here in Canada. There's a fair amount of Wrong Speak happening in Desiland, as it turns out, and in this episode, Niru and I will be examining how Canadian multiculturalism intersects with the debate over Sikh nationalism. Like Wrong Speak, Desiland is a TNKR media production. Thanks to Dan Delmar, Jessica Malis, and Fernando Helso for their hard work in making Wrong Speak what it is. And if you're looking to launch your own podcast or other media project, check them out at tnkr.ca. Also, don't forget to follow Wrong Speak on Facebook and Twitter, and if you have any editorial or sponsorship inquiries, you can reach us at wrongspeak@gmail.com. Thank you to all our fans who already help promote the show on social media. And now, as promised, let's hear from Craig Lauzon, whom I spoke to at the Transact Club in Toronto, where he recently appeared in An Unsafe Space, a play written and directed by Richard Klagsbrun. In fact, those sounds you hear in the background are theater workers preparing the set for the show as we did our interview. So apologies for the less than studio quality acoustics. An Unsafe Space is a comedy with a message. It's about a university cocktail party full of progressive activists and social justice warriors who get a rude awakening when the host's boyfriend shows up. An ordinary guy lawyer who has trouble navigating progressive slogans and hashtags. And eventually, he fires back with some of his own, more classically liberal views on politics. Here's a snippet from the play.
You are showing no sensitivity to his racialized, marginalized status. I have given you leeway because you are a member of a marginalized people. No more. Shame on you. I know plenty of Aboriginals who would be ashamed to hear the sorts of things you're saying.
What is with you people and race? You know, I've met more racists here tonight than I have in the last 6 months.
So you saying we're racist?
Well, for a group of people who aren't supposed to be, you sure spend a lot of time obsessing about race. You all seem to think that I should think certain things because I'm Aboriginal. Like I'm not an individual. I'm First Nations, and we must all think the same way. And if I don't take the official native stance on something, then there must be something wrong with me. Race only makes a difference to the extent that people treat you differently because of it. And only assholes treat you differently because of your race. And I'm not going to let the terms of my life be dictated by a bunch of assholes, not if they're right-wing racist assholes, and not if they're left-wing racist assholes hiding behind being progressive.
That ordinary guy you're hearing, his character's name is Oliver Waterman in the production, and he's played by the aforementioned Craig Lauzon. Lauzon is a well-known comedian who starred on CBC TV's flagship comedy sketch show, Royal Canadian Air Farce. He also founded the sketch comedy troupe Tantos Nephews. I interviewed him just prior to the final showing of An Unsafe Space. Here is that conversation. Tell me about your relationship with the character Oliver Waterman. Do you two have the same views on most issues?
The portrayal of him, I feel, is me, in that I think it was written with a different sort of take. Richard has often said that when he wrote it, he was watching a lot of Curb Your Enthusiasm. And I don't know that he'd be as likable as that kind of a character, but people seem to walk away from the show saying, even if they didn't like the politics of what he was saying, were like, I wanted to hate him, but I liked him so much. So in that part is me. I don't necessarily agree with all of the things he says. There's definitely parts of it that I do agree with and do share the same point of view with, though.
At one point in the play, your character, Oliver Waterman, says, in so many words, the most beleaguered minority in our society is the individual, which sounds like something out of Ayn Rand. Is that something you believe?
Nah, I mean, I do think that the individual is tossed aside for the as he keeps going in that speech, the greater good, the larger mass of people. He definitely comes from that idea of he also talks about not agreeing with elders having authority and Native people should just have the same rights as regular citizens, which is something my brother-in-law also aspires to in his beliefs.
One of the themes in the play is the idea that many progressives, despite being on the left, have actually become extremely deferential to authority. For instance, one of the most left-wing characters in the play is constantly reciting the safe spaces policy dictated by the university and sounds almost like an establishment authoritarian figure. Is this something you were conscious of as the play was going into production?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that was Richard's intent, and I share that view that I've often said on my Facebook and other platforms that the far left is the new right, because I feel like they're just as close-minded as how I feel about people on the far right. If you don't ascribe to whatever they say, they shut you out immediately, or they run you down, or I mean, not with a vehicle, but like smear campaigns, all that stuff happens online. Just happening today, actually. There is a woman. She's a comedian and also an activist, and she's a black woman. And there is a gallery that has some sort of showing. And the photo that they were using as advertisement was of Lakaluk Williamson, who's a Greenlandic Inuit dance mask performer. And if you know anything about that form, which a lot of people may not, and obviously she did not, they perform with a heavy black makeup with often red markings on it as well. But it's been done for hundreds and hundreds of years, and she complained to the gallery and got them to change the image to something else. I'm not sure what they did, and I had posted on her. She had posted a thing saying they were reasonable. They listened. They heard my plea, and I said, I get where you're coming from, and blackface is definitely wrong, but this is not that. This is Greenlandic cultural mask and dance. Like, I know where you're coming from, but this isn't that. And then a few of her friends or acquaintances, whatever, just started slamming me down on there. Called me F6. Do you know what F6 is? I had to look it up. It's white privilege. I don't know where it comes from. I don't know where the genesis of it was, but she said, called me F6 and to shut my chicken lips, my little thin chicken lips. And so anyway, I said that I had no authority to speak on this. And I was like, well, I'm an Indigenous person. I'm talking to the Indigenous aspect of the photo. I'm not being unreasonable. All I did was state facts. It's not an opinion. That's what that photo is. But I got slammed by a bunch of people on her page. So
you're Ojibwe, as I understand. The character you play is Seneca in background. Is there any sort of tension in regards to cultural appropriation or anything like that when people from different Indigenous communities play characters from other Indigenous communities?
I and other Native actors and the umbrella of Asian actors, whatever that term actually means, play other people within that group all the time. You'd have a very small group of people to pick from if you only had to pick from Seneca actors to play that part.
At one point in the play, your character seems to take a dig at the tension between free-thinking individuals and deference to elders within one's community. Is that something that's embedded subtly within the plot?
I don't know how subtle it is. I don't know that there's much in the show that is very subtle. Yeah, it definitely does. He says that he doesn't agree with activism and that he grew up with activists who wanted, and he describes them as self-interested elders.
Although I guess you could say that the term elder is used somewhat ambiguously in the play. Like maybe it's referring to generically elder people, but not necessarily in the Indigenous context.
When an Indigenous person says an elder, they're generally speaking about the people that have sort of say in the community. And the thing that I wanted to stress with Richard and in playing this part is that these are Oliver's points of view and ideas. I'm not speaking for the Seneca in it, or Oliver is not speaking for all of the Seneca. He's not speaking for Indigenous people. He's speaking for himself, and that's the idea of being the individual.
As we're having this discussion, there's a conflict playing out in British Columbia within some Indigenous communities about the question of whether traditional band leaders or elected band leaders get to speak for the community. Is there a sort of microcosm of that embedded in this play?
Yeah, I suppose it is. Traditionally, for like the idea of being elected is sort of a colonial thing. So there is always going to be people who don't agree with being elected into the positions. But then, if it was always hereditary, then it's, is that better? Because then it comes from the same group of people over and over again,
You've got some controversial characters in this play, not just you and Oliver Waterman, but you've got a militant lesbian feminist character, and the actress who plays her really hams it up, and it's actually very funny and self-assured and self-aware, but it's controversial, I guess. You have a Muslim character, you have a young social justice warrior character. Has there been any blowback from the portrayal of this kind of character? Has anyone complained?
Not to my knowledge, but in an interesting way. I think it's one of those things where Richard, I feel, created this piece because he wanted to sort of combat the other side of these arguments that are put in mainstream theaters all the time, and there was no home for it, so he had to produce it himself. And I would imagine that the people, and one of the issues is that those shows, people going to those theaters to see those shows already believe those things, and they're just reaffirmed their ideas and their beliefs by watching those shows. So he had this show to be on the opposite side of that, but the people coming to see this show are the people who already sort of believe those things and agree with those ideas. So it's you kind of want the opposite audience to come, but it's in an odd way, it hasn't happened. It's been people who, unless it's friends and family, the people who are coming to see the show are more in the agreement side of the things. I haven't heard anything to the opposite, actually.
You have one great line where somebody's reciting a land acknowledgement and you say something to the effect of, "Screw the land acknowledgement, give me the land." Was there any point in the rehearsal or production of this play where you guys were shooting around lines and maybe there was a really funny line and one of you just said, "You know what, that's too much, that's over the top, it's something we have to take out"?
No, it was more, the only things that really changed were for accuracy, because I think, I don't know, I can't really speak to this because I don't know, but I don't know how much Richard researched the groups that he's written about. And so you'd come across something that kind of seemed a little hinky, and you'd be like, I don't know if this is actually accurate or if it's just your opinion of what that thing is. For an example, we deal with land acknowledgements within the show, and the way it was initially written, there was a real heavy slant on ownership of the land and who owned the land. And I've never, maybe there are some out there, but I've never heard and or seen and or read a land acknowledgement that talks about ownership of the land. It's always about, the original caretakers or the people that are here now that are, now taking care of the land. And it's always more about taking care of the land than it is about these groups own the land. So the land acknowledgement was changed to reflect a more, especially these characters coming from a university. The person saying it is most likely saying the one that they have at the university. And, if you read the U of T one or the Ryerson one or whoever's one, it's about sharing the land and acknowledging the original caretakers and the people that are here now. And so it was changed to reflect more of that. And then, in the end, they're like, Oliver kind of finds the land acknowledgement in itself to be condescension. And so they're sort of combating him on that. And he says, look, if you're really serious about Native rights, then give us, or keep your land acknowledgements and give us the land back. That's where you were going at the end there. That part I kind of agree with.
We learn a lot about the backstory of different characters in this play. But your character, Oliver Waterman, we don't really hear much about his backstory, like whether he grew up on a reserve or whether he grew up in a big city. Was that a conscious editorial decision within the play?
Okay, I'll say two things about it. One is that the reason I liked the character to begin with initially when I read it was that he wasn't a stereotypical Indigenous character that I've played and I've seen played a million times on stage or on film. He's a lawyer because he wants to be a lawyer. He wants to make money. He just wants a good life. He's not become a lawyer because he's trying to save his band or his nation or change the world or make the planet a better place. He's just a guy who became a lawyer because he wants to be a lawyer, like why normal people outside the First Nations community become lawyers, because they want to, have a BMW. And so that part of it is God, I can't remember where I was going at the beginning part. Oh, right, the backstory. Well, he does say I grew up with activists who wanted self-important elders. So that to me indicates that he grew up on a reserve at some point and left, and didn't agree with the politic of what was happening at the reserve. So there is a little hint to it, but as I said before, I don't know how much research and or delving into this character was done. I really feel I've said this to Richard too, but I really feel that he made Oliver Native so that he could talk about certain issues without coming off F6.
One theme that comes out within the play is the idea that white characters are pressuring your character to be more authentically Indigenous as they see it through their white eyes. Does this mirror experiences that you've had in real life?
Yeah, it happens to me quite a bit. My father is Ojibwe and my mother is British, and so I always say I am Canada because he was also Quebecer, but they were able to split up. I get it from both sides, where there's a sort of a concept sometimes that happens with people from outside my community, usually white people, that not always, but usually, that there's a certain belief that since I pass for white, I should be happy to do that, or that I can pass for white, that I should be happy to do that. And it's less to do with the tone of my skin. I get my mother's coloring, but I have my dad's eyes, I have my dad's cheekbones, I have my dad's smile, and I really cherish that part of my being is the Ojibwe side. And I also like blood pudding and crumpets, but to me my native side is just as, if not more important to me than the other side. I love it. So I shouldn't have to do either. Just because I can pass doesn't mean I should be happy to.
You have lots of acting credits to your name, including work with the CBC, including the show Farce, which of course is well known and has been for many years. Is this kind of play something that would be safe for CBC?
Somebody else asked that same question. And I mean, I think that we have dealt with similar issues, but it's done in a more, I don't want to, what would the term be? Kid glove way, I guess. It's just a little softer. This show is being done for a specific audience. That show is done for the entire country. Right. So it's it has to appeal to a greater audience.
maybe time to get specific. You have one joke in the play, which is absolutely hilarious. It's where your character is trying to demonstrate sensitivity to a character who's not necessarily straight. And in so doing, you deliver this send-up of the campaign against homophobia to keep this safe for family radio. I'm not going to explain it. But suffice it to say that it was a scathing and not entirely politically correct treatment of gay sex. Is that something that could ever make it onto mainstream CBC airwaves?
Yeah, I mean, things that I know that they often shy away from are in this show for sure. It'd be hard pressed to find any Muslim jokes because of fear of backlash, and there's been times where there's been jokes written about Islam or being Muslim or whatever it is, and done in a, not in a. It's still in the air farce genre. It's not, it's not necessarily the most biting or nasty of ways at all, and it's still pulled. Sometimes it's pulled by the show producers, sometimes it's pulled by the corporation producers.
My own suspicion is that when we criticize people for being politically correct, those people are not actually being oversensitive themselves. Often they are acting in anticipation of other people being oversensitive. Is this something that figures into your approach?
Oh, I agree with that a lot. I've had so many arguments with people that are offended for other groups. And it's like, have you spoken to the group? Like, do you know that, And then again, you're talking to groups, and it's like individuals. There's always going to be an individual or several individuals that are offended by a thing, but there'll also be ones that are not. The majority of First Nations people that I know hate the Washington football team name, but there are also, obviously, because they parade them out every time that they have the discussion, the Washington owner always has like 2 or 3 chiefs that are like, yeah, we don't mind, we don't care, and it's like that's their opinion and that's their belief and that's fine. So there's always going to be individuals on both sides that agree and disagree. I was just trying to think of a way to say this because I've been having this conversation a lot since doing this play, but it's like just because you're offended doesn't make you right, and just because you don't like what's being said doesn't make it wrong. You can be offended by something and dislike something and it still be valid.
You're part of a comedy troupe called Tantos Nephew. Can you tell listeners something about that?
We're all people that are of Indigenous descent. I say, well, whatever, Native. We're all Native. Some are Salish from BC. A couple are Ojibwe. There's a Cree Métis. And then what is Sid? I don't even know. He's Bush Indian. He lives in North Bay, but I think he's Salish as well. So we're all from different backgrounds, and before I was in the troupe, they were called Other People's Children, and then the idea of other people's kids are trouble, and then decided to change the name to Tantos Nephews, even though one of them's a woman, but she was fine with it. So we write and perform and improvise comedy. We do workshops. And I'll say this, one of the things that drives us nuts is when people describe us as a Native comedy troupe. And we're just a comedy troupe, We just like to be known as a comedy troupe. We had a radio pilot years ago, and we wrote some things that had to do with being Native, as because we all are, but some stuff that wasn't. One piece in particular called the OnStar of David, which was like in the cars OnStar. Yeah, so it was OnStar of David, and you press it, and you're like, oh, so you're in trouble, and now you call. Like that's the kind of. And the radio producers were like, well, this stuff is great, but like, what do these ones have to do with being Native? And we're like, well, nothing. This one's called OnStar of David. It's got to do and so it literally the words. Well, then why would we so we said, but is it funny? And they're like, well, yes, but it has nothing to do with being Native. So we were like, so everything we have to write has to have to do with being Native. And they're like, well, yeah, like, why would we hire you over anyone else? And it's like, well, you know, who was in the Irrelevant show? Were they all white people? I don't even know. But did everything that they write have to do with being, you know, white, straight people from Edmonton? No. They could write about whatever they wanted to, I would imagine.
As we're having this interview, there have been a number of controversies in the last few months regarding comedians who were seen to cross the line and get thrown off stages and stuff for being politically incorrect. What's your take on this? Is this something that you worry about as a comedian?
So here's my 2 cents on that. Political correctness isn't... It's a pain in the ass for a lot of people because then you can't go to the easy thing that was your go-to thing before. So if you're doing comedy, there's a challenge there. There always has been a challenge, and the challenge is to make the audience laugh. Now, the parameters of what people find funny are changing, and you need to adapt to that. So it's not... There's a challenge, and you either meet the challenge or you go do something else. The universities aren't saying, come and do whatever comedy you want, and then freaking out when you tell a gay joke or a black joke or whatever it is. They're saying, come and do comedy, but don't talk about religion, don't talk about this, don't talk about that. And if you don't want to do that, no one's forcing you to do that. There's a lot of comedians that don't do corporate gigs because they've had to do that for a long time. You can't go to, IBM to do their Christmas show and do those. You haven't been able to do that for 30 years, you know? So it's just that because universities used to be the place, we kind of talked about this in the play too, it used to be the place where subversive stuff happened. And now it seems to be the opposite side where, you know, like the guy in the play keeps saying, well, that's against school policy. That's against school policy. Where it was like, used to be the students were like, screw school policy. You know, I want to do this. But I mean, they're laying it out plainly. Don't talk about these things, or don't do the show. And so it's up to you.
In the controversy around Louis C.K., the main point of discussion wasn't so much what Louis C.K. did on stage; it's what he did backstage, as it were, and his behavior toward women. Is it the case that comedy does have a problem with the way it treats women, with the way it treats female performers? When you heard Louis C.K.'s story, is that something that you saw as having a real-world equivalent on the Canadian comedy circuit?
It's funny, like, I don't know if I was just lucky or what, but the comedians and the people that I have known coming up have always been very supportive of female comics. It's there may have been one or two along the way, and they get the gears from the guys. Like, they're like, look, man, you can't, you know, Kate Davis and, oh God, I'm blanking on people's names right now, but they're like, they've always been there since I've been doing it. Laurie Elliott, Kate Davis, Joanna Downey, who was like, she was mama for everybody. Like, she helped nurture young guy comics. And tons of female comics, like very supportive, very genuine. Watkins Shaw and Christine Von Hagen, like all these amazing comics have always been treated like an equal in what I have seen.
Craig Lauzon, thank you so much for being on Wrong Speak.
Thank you for having me.
This has been a production of TNKR Media. Good talk.